The sun was a molten disk sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet town of Hollow Creek. It was a sleepy place, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. At the edge of town lay Black Hollow Lake, a body of water so dark and still it seemed to drink in the light around it. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. For generations, Black Hollow Lake had been the subject of whispered warnings and grim legends. Parents in Hollow Creek would lower their voices and speak with stern authority when telling their children to stay away. "Don't go near that lake," they would say. "It's not safe." No one ever explained why, but the stories passed down over the years were enough to cement the rule as unbreakable. Everyone knew someone who had lost someone to the lake, or so they said. Drownings, disappearances, strange sights and sounds. 17-year-old Kyle was not one to heed warnings. Reckless by nature and stubborn to a fault, he had always resented the rules and limits that seemed to define his life in Hollow Creek. His friends often teased him for his inability to leave well enough alone, but Kyle took pride in his curiosity. Rules, he believed, were made to be tested. So, when he overheard a group of older kids daring each other to swim in Black Hollow Lake, Kyle's decision was made. That evening, he told his mom he was staying at a friend's house for the night. In truth, he had packed a flashlight, a towel, and his swimming trunks. By the time the moon hung high and pale in the sky, Kyle was on his bike, pedaling hard down the dirt trail that led to the lake. The air grew cooler as he approached, and the trees lining the trail seemed to close in, their gnarled branches forming twisted shadows. Kyle felt a thrill of nerves as he reached the clearing where the lake came into view. It was even darker than he'd imagined, the water black as ink and utterly still. Not a ripple disturbed its surface. The only sound was the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Kyle stood at the edge of the lake, his heart pounding. He couldn't quite shake the unease that had crept over him. He knew the stories, the ones about ghostly figures that wandered the shore, about strange lights beneath the water, about people who went in and never came out. But those were just stories, he told himself, and he wasn't going to chicken out now. He stripped down to his trunks, dropped his towel on the bank, and waded into the water. It was cold, colder than he'd expected, but refreshing. The sensation jolted his senses, and he laughed aloud at the absurdity of his fear. He paddled further out, the water closing over his shoulders. The lake was eerily quiet. Kyle floated on his back, staring up at the stars. It was almost peaceful, until he heard it. A splash, faint but distinct, from somewhere nearby. He sat upright in the water, his heart suddenly racing. "Hello?" he called out. His voice echoed back to him, bouncing off the surrounding trees. There was no reply, just the same stillness and silence. He told himself it was probably a fish or maybe a bird diving for food, nothing to worry about. But then, he felt it. Something brushed against his leg, something cold and slimy. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. It could have been seaweed, he thought, or a stray branch. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was something else, something alive. The water around him rippled, even though he wasn't moving. He turned slowly, scanning the surface. The moonlight glinted off the waves, but he saw nothing unusual. And then, just as he was about to laugh at himself for being so jumpy, he saw it. A figure was standing on the shore, barely visible in the dim light. At first, Kyle thought it was another person, maybe one of the older kids trying to scare him. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized something was wrong. The figure was unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs elongated and angular. Its face was pale and featureless, like a mask, and its movements were jerky, as though it were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Kyle's blood ran cold. He blinked, hoping the figure would vanish, but it remained, motionless and staring. He tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat, and then slowly the figure stepped into the water. Panic surged through Kyle. He turned and swam as fast as he could toward the opposite shore, his arms and legs churning the water. The sound of splashing grew louder behind him, and he didn't dare look back. He could feel the presence of the figure, feel it closing the distance. When his feet finally touched the muddy bottom, he scrambled onto the bank, gasping for breath. He turned to look back at the lake, expecting to see the figure emerging from the water. But the surface was still and undisturbed, as though nothing had happened. Kyle didn't waste any time. He grabbed his clothes and his flashlight and sprinted back to his bike. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He didn't stop pedaling until he was back in town, the safety of streetlights and houses surrounding him. That night, he barely slept. His dreams were filled with images of the figure, its blank face and jerky movements haunting him. When he finally drifted off, it was only to wake up in a cold sweat. In the days that followed, Kyle tried to convince himself it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the light and his overactive imagination. But strange things began to happen. He started finding wet footprints outside his bedroom window, even though it hadn't rained. At night, he would hear faint tapping sounds on the glass, as though someone or something was trying to get in. Desperate, he confided in his best friend Sam. At first, Sam laughed it off, calling Kyle paranoid. But when he saw the look in Kyle's eyes, he realized this was no joke. Together, they decided to return to the lake and try to figure out what was happening. Armed with flashlights and a bundle of sage from Sam's superstitious grandmother, they set out at dusk. The trail to the lake felt longer this time, the trees more oppressive. When they arrived, the water was as still and black as ever, reflecting the crescent moon like a shard of glass. They stood at the edge, unsure of what to do. Sam muttered something about ghosts and restless spirits, but Kyle was focused on the water. He thought he saw movement beneath the surface, shadows shifting and swirling. Suddenly, a hand shot out of the water, pale and skeletal, gripping Kyle's ankle. He screamed, stumbling backward, but the hand held fast. Sam grabbed a stick and began beating at it, shouting curses and prayers in equal measure. The hand released its grip and disappeared into the water, leaving only ripples behind. The two of them didn't wait to see what would happen next. They ran, leaving behind the sage and their flashlights. They didn't stop until they were back in town, breathless and shaken. Kyle never went near Black Hollow Lake again. He didn't need another warning. Whatever was in that water wasn't human, and it wasn't bound by the rules of the living. The townspeople never learned what happened that night, and Kyle never told anyone else. But every now and then, when he passed by the lake on his way out of town, he could feel eyes watching him. And in the darkest corners of his mind, he could still see that pale, featureless face staring back at him. The nightmares persisted, their grip tightening as the days turned into weeks. Every night, Kyle found himself back in Black Hollow Lake, its icy depths pulling him under as that figure watched from the shore. He woke up gasping for air, his sheets damp with sweat, and the sensation of phantom hands gripping his ankles. Sleep became a luxury, his mind consumed by what he had seen, or thought he had seen. Sam, who had initially been skeptical, grew increasingly uneasy. The memory of the skeletal hand clawing at Kyle's ankle refused to fade, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something far older and darker than them lurked in that lake. "We need to figure out what's going on," Sam told Kyle one afternoon as they sat in the back of the local diner. His voice was low, cautious, as though speaking the words aloud might summon the thing they feared. Kyle shook his head violently. "I'm not going back there. Ever. Not for any reason." "I'm not saying we go back," Sam said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But there has to be an explanation. We could ask around, talk to people who know the history of the lake." "What good will that do?" Kyle snapped. He had been on edge ever since that night, his nerves frayed. "Do you think some story is going to fix this? Do you think knowing why that thing is there will make it go away?" Sam didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began searching for anything he could find about Black Hollow Lake. The stories were easy to uncover. Black Hollow Lake had been a source of mystery and fear for over a century. It was said to have formed after a massive sinkhole swallowed part of the forest in the late 1800s. Since then, the water had been linked to countless tragedies: fishermen who drowned without explanation, boats that capsized on calm days, entire families who vanished during picnics by the shore. There were even older rumors, whispered by the town's elders, about the land being cursed long before the lake existed. One story in particular caught Sam's attention. In the 1920s, a group of teenagers had gone swimming in the lake on a dare. Much like Kyle, only one of them returned, and he was found wandering the woods days later, incoherent and covered in deep scratches. Before his death years later, he often spoke of seeing the Hollow Man, a tall, faceless figure that emerged from the water. Sam shared the story with Kyle, who listened in grim silence. "It's the same thing," Kyle muttered, his voice barely audible. "The same thing I saw." Sam nodded. And if it's been happening this long, maybe someone knows how to stop it. Reluctantly, Kyle agreed to help with the research, though every instinct told him to forget about the lake and move on. Together, they visited the town library, scoured old newspaper archives, and spoke with anyone who might have insight. Most people dismissed their questions, unwilling to talk about the lake. But an old man named Mr. Hargrove, who ran a dusty antique shop on Main Street, seemed to know more than he let on. "You boys should leave well enough alone," he warned when they brought up Black Hollow Lake. His eyes, clouded with age, still held a sharpness that made Kyle uneasy. "That place is no good. Never has been." "What's in there?" Kyle asked, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound brave. Mr. Hargrove hesitated, then sighed. "There's an old legend. Before the settlers came, the land around the lake belonged to the Nahanni tribe. They believed the lake was a doorway to the underworld, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. They called it the Mirror of Shadows. Said it was cursed by a shaman who was betrayed by his own people. His anger poisoned the land and his spirit became the Hollow Man, always searching for someone to take his place." Kyle felt a chill run down his spine. "Take his place?" The old man nodded. "It's said that the Hollow Man needs a soul to remain bound to the lake. If he doesn't take one, he grows stronger and begins to seep into the world beyond the water. That's why the warnings have been passed down, to keep the balance, to keep him contained." Sam leaned forward, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "But why does he only take some people and not others? There are plenty of stories about people going near the lake and being fine." Mr. Hargrove shook his head. "It's not random. He chooses those who are bold enough to enter his domain, who challenge the boundaries of his prison. Once you've stepped into his water, he marks you, and once you're marked, it's only a matter of time." Kyle's stomach dropped. "You mean he's still after me?" The old man didn't answer, but the look in his eyes was enough. That night, Kyle lay awake in bed, his mind racing. The idea of being marked terrified him, but it also explained the strange events. The wet footprints, the tapping at his window, the muddy water in his room. The Hollow Man wasn't done with him, and if the legend was true, Kyle's only options were to find a way to break the curse or become the Hollow Man's next victim. The next day, Kyle and Sam returned to the lake, armed with everything they could think of. Salt, sage, candles, and an old book of rituals they had found at a second-hand store. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, and the lake seemed even darker than before, as though it had absorbed the surrounding light. They set up a circle of candles on the shore and lit the sage, hoping to cleanse the area. Kyle stood at the edge of the water, his heart pounding as he recited the words from the book. The language was unfamiliar, the syllables foreign on his tongue, but he spoke them with conviction. For a moment, nothing happened. The lake remained calm, its surface like black glass. Then, without warning, the water began to ripple violently, as though something massive was stirring beneath. The candles flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. Kyle stumbled backward, his pulse racing. "Sam, we need to leave!" But before they could move, the figure emerged from the water. It was taller than Kyle remembered, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its blank face seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, and its movements were unnatural, as though it were both gliding and jerking forward at the same time. Kyle froze, his body paralyzed with fear. The Hollow Man raised one spindly arm and pointed directly at him. The air grew colder, and Kyle felt a strange pressure in his chest, as though his very soul were being pulled toward the figure. Sam shouted something, breaking Kyle out of his trance. He grabbed Kyle's arm and yanked him back toward the trees. They ran blindly through the forest, the sound of splashing water echoing behind them. The Hollow Man was chasing them, its inhuman strides closing the distance with terrifying speed. They burst out of the woods onto the dirt trail, their lungs burning and legs trembling. Kyle risked a glance over his shoulder, but the Hollow Man was nowhere to be seen. The lake was silent and still, as though nothing had happened. Breathing heavily, Sam turned to Kyle. "We need help, real help, someone who knows what they're doing." It was then that Kyle remembered Mrs. Ashcroft, a reclusive woman who lived on the outskirts of town. She was known for her knowledge of folklore and the occult, and though many dismissed her as a kook, Kyle was willing to try anything. The next morning, they visited her small, cluttered house, explaining everything they had experienced. Mrs. Ashcroft listened intently, her expression grave. When they finished, she nodded slowly. "The Hollow Man is bound to the lake," she said, "but his power extends to those he marks. He'll torment you until you either succumb or face him directly." "Face him?" Kyle asked, his voice rising with panic. "You mean go back there?" Mrs. Ashcroft nodded. "You must sever the bond he's created. There's a ritual, but it's dangerous. If you fail, the Hollow Man will take your soul and his power will grow stronger." Despite his fear, Kyle agreed to the ritual. He had no other choice. That night, under Mrs. Ashcroft's guidance, Kyle and Sam returned to the lake one final time. The air was electric with tension, the water eerily calm. Mrs. Ashcroft drew a circle of protection on the ground and handed Kyle a dagger inscribed with strange symbols. "You must enter the water and confront him," she said. "Use the dagger to break his hold on you, but be warned, he will do everything in his power to stop you." Kyle swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he stepped into the lake. The cold water sent a shock through his body, but he pressed on, wading deeper and deeper until the water reached his chest. The Hollow Man appeared almost instantly, rising from the depths with a horrifying grace. Its blank face tilted toward Kyle, and it let out a low guttural sound that resonated deep within his bones. Kyle gripped the dagger tightly, his knuckles white. The Hollow Man moved toward him, its long arms outstretched. Kyle hesitated, fear threatening to overwhelm him, but then he thought of everything he had endured, of the footprints, the tapping, the nightmares, and a surge of determination filled him. He lunged forward, plunging the dagger into the Hollow Man's chest. The figure let out an ear-piercing scream, its body convulsing violently. The water around them churned and boiled, and for a moment Kyle thought he might drown. But then, the Hollow Man dissolved into the water, its form disintegrating like smoke. The lake grew calm, and the oppressive weight that had hung over Kyle lifted. Exhausted and trembling, Kyle made his way back to shore, where Sam and Mrs. Ashcroft were waiting. "It's done," Mrs. Ashcroft said, her voice soft but certain. Kyle nodded, his body shaking with relief. He knew he would never forget the horrors he had faced, but for the first time in weeks, he felt free. Black Hollow Lake remained as dark and foreboding as ever, but Kyle would never return. The Hollow Man was gone, but the lake's secrets were far from over. Some doors, he realized, should never be opened. Months passed, and the events at Black Hollow Lake became a distant shadow in Kyle's life, though not one he could ever fully escape. Sleep returned in fractured fragments, free from the suffocating nightmares that had plagued him for so long. But there were scars, ones that weren't visible to the eye. Kyle found himself watching shadows too closely, flinching at the sound of running water and avoiding the lake at all costs. Sam tried to move on too, though he was never quite the same. He stopped teasing Kyle about his reckless nature and avoided mentioning the lake entirely. The bond between the two friends remained, but there was an unspoken distance, a shared trauma neither could articulate. When Kyle looked at Sam, he saw the panic in his friend's eyes from that night, the moment they both knew their lives hung by a thread. One evening, as the leaves turned amber and gold with the arrival of autumn, Kyle found himself drawn to Mrs. Ashcroft's home again. He didn't know what he was looking for. Perhaps reassurance, perhaps answers. When he knocked on her door, the old woman greeted him with the same calm but piercing gaze she had given him the first time they met. "I wondered if you'd come back," she said, ushering him inside. Kyle sat down in her cluttered living room, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "It's over, isn't it? The Hollow Man, I mean." Mrs. Ashcroft regarded him for a long moment before answering. "Yes, the Hollow Man is gone, but the lake isn't. Whatever darkness created him still lingers, tied to the water itself. It's dormant now, but that doesn't mean it's gone." The words sent a chill through Kyle. "So, it could happen again?" "Perhaps," she admitted. "Evil like that doesn't disappear. It waits. It feeds on the curious, the desperate, the brave. That lake has claimed many lives, Kyle, and unless its curse is truly broken, it may claim more." Kyle's heart sank. "How do we break it? For good?" Mrs. Ashcroft hesitated, her eyes softening. "There are theories, ancient rituals, but they're dangerous. Far more than what you've already faced. It's not a task for one person, and it requires a level of power and sacrifice few are willing to give." Kyle sat in silence. the weight of her words pressing down on him. He didn't know if he had the strength to face the lake again, not after everything it had taken from him. As he left her house, the evening air was crisp and still, the horizon painted with streaks of orange and purple. He looked toward the direction of the lake, hidden behind the hills and trees, and felt an odd sense of resolve. Hollow Creek might not yet be free of its haunting legacy, but Kyle knew one thing. He would never let anyone else face what he had endured. If the time came to confront the lake's curse again, he would be ready. He would ensure no one else became a prisoner of the Hollow Man. And deep beneath the dark waters of Black Hollow Lake, something stirred, waiting, watching, and biding its time. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us. What are your thoughts on why he was told not to swim in the lake? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.